This is the unrestricted free agent.
Welcome into the program. Glad you're here. And I just pulled my microphone completely off the table.
I think South Carolina's catching Clemson. I really do.
Defense, I'm going to tell you right now, they're nasty. They're going to be nasty all year.
Coach Spurrier couldn't give a damn.
Who knows what's real and what's not even anymore?
When you see black and white and you're calling it purple, I got problems with that.
And LC, I told you, it's all about the deer talk.
How about that for a start? How are you on Tuesday morning? Through 2 weeks of the college football season, you doing okay? Let me get my light on back here, take a sip of coffee, we'll get going. There we go. A little coffee this morning. Hope you're doing well. From what I saw on social media yesterday, which is probably a terrible gauge for seeing if people are doing well, it didn't seem great from a Gamecock perspective when you get the news that unfortunately 2 players are out for the season, 2 defensive starters on a defense that gave up almost half 100 to probably the 3rd best team in the SEC. I understand it. I mean, we could predict this every single year, right? Going into week number 3, if you're not 2-0, you can be upset as a college football fan. How am I sounding, by the way? Audio muffled. Thanks, Chris. Of course it is. Hit me off to a fun start this morning. So why don't we let's let Shane Beamer get us in here. How the offense. Oh, well, we ran that one a couple of times yesterday. Let's hear what Shane Beamer had to say about his offensive line in game number 2, and I'll try to clear up this audio.
I thought the offensive line did a nice job. I thought we protected well, for the most part. You're going to get beat at times, but we threw it a bunch, and thought overall we protected well. I know one time they brought 7 off the edge, and Juju picked him up, and I think Spencer got flushed out. So it's all of us involved in the passing game, but they overall they did a good job, and then run game wise, just continuing to call it. I mean, I'll be honest with you, Gene, we didn't have many called runs today. It was passed, but there's no question. I mean, our offensive line wants to run the ball. Our offensive line, we can run the ball. We got good backs as well, and just felt like that was the way we needed to attack things today.
Okay, hopefully coming in bright and clear now. 125th, I looked it up this morning. Nerd alert. 131 teams, major college football. Chris, really appreciate the thumbs up this morning. And I'm really being rude. My apologies. Good morning to you, DC. First one in at 6:54 this morning. Anthony, good morning to all the UFAs is where he's going with. Well done, sir. Sunny outlook for Roger this morning as usual. Ken's in with the Robin Williams-esque extra good morning. Chris, morning, Tim. Fellow Gamecocks, took forever for the season to start. Now we're going into week 3. Time flies. Great point. Craig, what's good, man? Yeah, it was weird this morning, Anthony. Thank you. I didn't touch it. I appreciate the compliment on it's not quite perfect. Let's get that part over there. It's a lighting in here, too. That thing's thinning out pretty good. Jason, good morning to you, sir. Really appreciate you guys hopping on. The unrestricted free agent here, streaming live 8 to 10 every Monday through Friday. Everything's on the table. Okay? This, I was going to say this is a safe space, but just saying that. Patrick with a barnyard in this morning. Very patriotic, Patrick. Well done, sir. Not for the barnyard, for the avatar on Facebook Live. Good for you. Thanks for finding us, man. Thanks all you guys for popping in here. I know it's this is a different way to do things, right? Certainly different for me, not being on traditional radio or TV, but it's a blast. There are no restrictions. We can talk about whatever we want to talk about. I was going to say it's a safe space. No, that's probably, I probably ranted about that, right? It is a place to come here to be heard. All right. Nobody's trying to do gotcha. I'm not trying to tell you that you shouldn't feel a certain way or that you, I don't know. We're here to talk it out. We're here to talk it out this morning. Thanks, Chris. Nice doing your things your own way. Well, it is massively freeing for sure as the Tonester weighs in as well. So where was I going off the top there? Oh yeah, nerd alert, nerdy stat of the morning. Gamecock rush offense 125th out of 131 through 2 games. Now, if the 2 games were the first 2 games in the SEC, Arkansas and Georgia would be a completely skewed stat, right? But Georgia State was your first opponent. Arkansas's defense is not one of the best defenses in the SEC. It's just not. Now, we will talk this morning about, hey, who's going to be the 3rd best team in the SEC, and certainly Arkansas can lay claim to that right now. If you want to tell me that's Arkansas, I'm probably going to agree with you. But they had 2 starters out because of injury in the last game. And now, unfortunately, the news came down yesterday, kind of making it official. If you listen to Shane Beamer after the game on Saturday, I don't know how you could have forecasted anything different when a head coach says, yeah, it doesn't look good, especially the way that Shane Beamer talks about injuries. He does it very optimistically, typically. And so the official news yesterday that Jordan Strawn and Mo Kaba, the defensive end and linebacker, respectively, out for the season with torn ACLs. Brutal, but unfortunately not a surprise after hearing from Shane Beamer after the ball game. Also, unfortunately, this is what SEC football is, right? Every team, every year, deals with injuries like this. Typically, you don't get 2 in a game, but sometimes it happens, and that's where the Gamecock defense is. And now younger guys will have to step up, and you saw linebacker issues, especially with Kaba out of the game, and that was the first sports nerdy comment in DC right after the good morning, a few minutes after. He just wanted to get in 150-plus yards after contact. That stat alone kind of sums up the Arkansas game. It absolutely does, DC. But I think that's going to sum up Arkansas games for a lot of teams. And I think if you went into that game thinking that they weren't going to get triple digits after contact, I think you're fooling yourself. I think maybe that's where a lot of Gamecock fans are. Maybe not a lot, but some unrealistic fans are, as we sit here on a Tuesday morning, September 13th, 2022, 1 season and 2 games into the Shane Beamer era. After the 44-30 loss to Arkansas over the weekend, if you were one of those, what I would consider unrealistic fans saying 9-3, 10-2 this year, I get that you might be on a bit of an emotional roller coaster right now. If you were absolutely predicting an Arkansas win and the whole thing, I get that, but I think that's the minority. I think most Gamecock fans, if you have any kind of experience, maybe pre-Steve Spurrier Gamecock fans, or even, I should say, pre-2010 Gamecock fans, if you've been a Gamecock fan for longer than 12 years, I think you got to feel pretty decent about things, don't you? I'm not overselling this thing. Pretty decent is a pretty soft sell, I think. Craig, for instance, says, okay, guys, what's an acceptable result this weekend? And that's kind of how I entered the season. All right, what is progress? How do you keep this thing going in the right direction? Because college football playoff is great. Expanding from 4 to 12 teams is fantastic. South Carolina football's got a long way to go to get into any sort of conversation dealing with the college football playoff. The Belk Bowl win was fantastic. The Duke's Mayo Bowl win was fantastic, but it was the Duke's Mayo Bowl. And I'm not trying to steal any joy here. I'm just trying to be realistic. Yeah, Chris, no doubt, Kentucky's given Arkansas a run for that number 3 team in the SEC. Tennessee also in the conversation, right? They didn't look pretty against Pitt, and both backyard brawl teams actually losing game number 2, with West Virginia losing to Kansas. Got to make you scratch your head a little bit and say, all right, well, is Pitt really, I get it, defending ACC champs and the whole thing, but was that win at Pitt that good a win for Tennessee? That's the fun part about just 2 weeks in college football, right? Awesome. Troy coming in, feeling good. Anthony, your sorry Bucks beat my sorry Reds last night to pull within 4.5 games of the Reds in that titanic, epic battle for 4th place in the NL Central. Good stuff. And if we want to get another baseball note in there, Braves ended up losing their 3rd straight last night. Mets also lost, so still 1.5 games back. 24.5 point favorites is why Craig asks what he asks. What's an acceptable result this weekend? It is an unfortunate question to have to ask, isn't it? It's not, how can we win this weekend? It's, what is an acceptable result? But it is a logical question to ask. Now, I think as Craig asks that, I think it's ridiculous, and it's classic 2022 social media. You have to pick a side, and you got to point and then get all keyboard cowboyed up. Craig's not saying that Carolina can't win. I didn't hear that there. If you're saying that and you're saying Craig's a bad fan and the whole thing, then you're just being dramatic. Stop it. Craig is saying when you're a 24.5 point underdog, you might want to look at things a little differently than if it's a pick'em game, right? You have to take a different perspective into a game than you would otherwise. Against the defending national champs, number 1 team in the country, South Carolina is not where Georgia is. It's just a fact, right? And it's unfortunate for sure from the South Carolina perspective. You guys remember, South Carolina, Georgia, in my mind, is always the early season game that typically would tell us which team is going to have the better season. Dramatic swig of coffee there. Thanks for your patience. From my perspective, again, 1981 was the first time I went to a Gamecock game. So through the years, if you're not familiar with Gamecock football, you don't think that it's a rivalry. I don't think nationally anybody says, oh, South Carolina and Georgia, that's definitely going to be a good one, or that series has a little extra something to it. But Gamecock fans certainly think that. I think Georgia fans think that they've lost a lot of games they shouldn't have lost to South Carolina through the years. The 2012 night game, Ace Sanders punt return, maybe the loudest it's ever been at Williams-Brice Stadium. If you have to look to a moment, I think that's the moment I would point out as the peak of Carolina football. I mean, maybe if you're more experienced than I am, a specific George Rogers run that helped clinch the Heisman. I don't know, maybe you want to go to the Mike Hold ball drop right in front of the fridge back in, what was that, 84-ish? Maybe right around there. You want to go the Brad Edwards pick 6 in the 87 Carolina Clemson game at night on ESPN. Mike Patrick on the call and the Rodney Chance going out that night. Okay. I remember I think it was a Sterling Sharp. It might have been a Ryan Bethea reverse for a touchdown. I want to say it's what my memory tells me that I saw in Blacksburg, Virginia, back in that Virginia Tech series that Shane Beamer often refers to as his real kind of welcome to big time college football moment growing up. But if I had to pick one, it would definitely be that Ace Sanders punt return where Carolina blows Georgia out at night at Williams-Brice Stadium, 2012, right smack in the middle of 3 straight top 10 seasons. It is not that anymore. It hasn't been that since Texas A&M came in, game number 1, 2014. South Carolina football has been struggling to get to national relevance ever since. And the struggle continues. And I would suggest to you, as we sit here in week number 3 in 2022, South Carolina is almost as close to national relevance as they've been in a long, long time. What, Kentucky home game at night? Was that year 3 or 4? I think that was year 3 of the Muschamp era. Really good. You obviously go 9-4, and you beat Michigan in an Outback Bowl in year 2. A high point. Just trying to go through kind of like the graph, relevant to irrelevant, or I should say relevant up top and then irrelevant through the years. I think it's a lot closer to that peak right now than it has been to the Valley. The 2-year season, two win season of a couple of years ago, 4 wins after that in the Will Muschamp era. Then you bounce back with 7 wins last year. So I guess this is my long-winded way to say I understand being a home 24.5-point underdog to Georgia is not where anybody associated with South Carolina football wants it to be, but it is a very fair question to ask, and I'm wondering what you guys think the answer is to Craig's question. What's an acceptable result? You look at what you can do realistically, Chris says. Ryan, good to see you, and sir, acceptable result, get it to the fourth quarter, make it a competitive game. This goes back to my entire philosophy about the season that I'll probably annoyingly continue to repeat until I feel like it is just widely accepted by everyone, or that we're all on the same page and I don't even have to talk about it anymore. But that was the whole point going into this season. I don't know how you evaluated South Carolina football differently headed into 2022, coming off of winning 7 games, but while doing that, knowing there were some ugly wins in there, man. Vandy, East Carolina, Troy, things could have gone the other way. And in those losses, outside of Missouri, there were a lot of ugly losses. I mean, outside of Missouri, there were a lot of uncompetitive losses. And so you had to close the gap between what we saw on the field last year. I'm going to say yesterday. I don't know why, but that was also kind of the philosophy that I took going in the Arkansas game. Probably not going to win it. You got to make sure it's a game. And when it was 21-3, that was a brutal start, which we've seen a lot in the Shane Beamer era, and it did not look good. It looked to me like regression instead of progress. You know what? Do we say regress? No one says that, right? How can progress be a word, but I guess you do say you regressed, but I've never heard regress used as a noun. Sorry, word nerd brain. It looked bad. And North Carolina's up 21-3 on Georgia State. Ooh, another way to kind of track what 2022 is going to be is look at your first opponent. But then things flipped, didn't they? 21-16. South Carolina's back in the game somehow on the road. Georgia State takes the lead against North Carolina, I think. It was 28-21. 25 straight points. And whoa, things just flip real quick. And it was the beauty of college football, right? Unfortunately, it didn't stay flipped. And North Carolina came back and won against Georgia State. Obviously, Arkansas took control of the game. And if you want to argue, and I think we should probably talk about it a bunch today, because the Arkansas perspective is that defense was good through 3 quarters, only gave up like 180-ish yards, maybe a little less than that passing. And then in the fourth quarter, gave up that again. And it got ugly from a defensive standpoint from Arkansas. And it was just a weird fourth quarter that took forever. And it was odd. So we need to figure out from the South Carolina perspective, how much credit do the Gamecocks get there? I think they deserve full credit. I would have had a different tone yesterday had I believed that was all garbage time and Arkansas was kind of checked out, whatever it was. No, it was still an SEC football game. And on the road in the fourth quarter, you still get credit unless you're down 35 points or something to that effect. And the Arkansas defense looked during that quarter, I think, more like I thought that they would look most of the game, very vulnerable to the pass. And South Carolina took advantage. I can't knock an offensive coordinator for not making adjustments and not give Carolina credit there in the fourth quarter. So, progress. I saw progress. I agree to some extent with what we heard from Shane Beamer about the offensive line playing better in week 2. Now, the main problem is 125th out of 131 when it comes to running the football in the country. And if you want to say, well, you also heard from Shane after the game that they just didn't have any called runs going in. They didn't think that was the most effective way to attack the Arkansas defense. Makes sense. Agreed. Fair. So you look at the Carolina passing offense. I got numbers for that too. Let me check my notes here. Nerded up completely. Push up the glasses. 24th. Pretty good from a pass offense perspective, right? Except when you combine 125th run offense, 24th best pass offense, you get 94th best offense out of 131 through 2 games. 2 games where you haven't played top defenses in the country. Georgia State and Arkansas not going to be top defenses in the country. Arkansas's pretty good. Arkansas, I would say, I would say that 2-game sample set is a very fair representation of the entire season, right? If not skewed a little bit towards slightly easier than you're going to see on the whole the entire season from an opposing defense perspective. And that is massively concerning, I think. Number one concern by far, offensive identity for South Carolina. What's it going to be? I think the numbers tell the story. I just think now, I think Shane Beamer, Marcus Satterfield need to embrace that, man. This is what the offense is going to be. Spencer Rattler's going to be the guy. Juice Wells leading the SEC in receiving. Let's go throw it around. We're going to spread people out. We're going to get the ball down the field. That is the offensive identity. We're going to run the football to keep them honest. There are good running backs in there who are kind of multi-purpose players as well. They can catch the ball out of the backfield. They can make you miss. But for whatever reason, that has not been the narrative. That has not been the sell of this Gamecock offense. And yes, Marcus Satterfield comes into a situation where he is being judged a little bit more harshly than a lot of other coordinators who come into a job, because he absolutely has to deal with leftover baggage from previous coordinators in the Will Muschamp era, and the Gamecock offense just hadn't been good for a while. That's what it is. I mean, and even with players, even with Deebo Samuel and Hayden Hurst, just watched them over the weekend, Hurst last night, and I'll get to a little Monday Night Football stuff as well. Even with players in the Will Muschamp era, the offense never got to a point where you would say, that's a good offense. I think they're going to go win you a bunch of games. Craig says he asked the question and now he answers it. Clever, Craig. My strategy this week would be to leave, is that Stog? Austin Stogner, Travian Kenyon in to block on runs and even some pass plays. So he's talking to go 2 tight ends, but not even talking about Jaheim Bell. I'm trying to get in there. We can't block them with 5. Wells, Brooks, and Bell out wide. See what happens. Actually try to run it. Craig. I understand what you're saying. That's the part about going empty with Spencer Rattler, with just presumably your 5 offensive linemen to block, which weren't very good in game number 1. A little bit better against Arkansas, but still gave up 6 sacks. I mean, that's a sad state of affairs when you give up 6 sacks and your head coach goes into the post-game press conference and says, yeah, offensive line played better. It was true. Don't get me wrong. I agree with the assessment. I just think they were that bad in game number 1. So with a 7-man line, yeah, I see what you're saying. You can't run it against Georgia State. You're going to run it against Georgia? You're averaging 2 yards per carry, Craig. 2 yards per carry. You think wouldn't Georgia much prefer? I mean, Georgia fans right now would lick their chops for that. You're going to try to man up on us and out physical us, and that's your theory to pull an upset? To me, that sounds like you're just trying to limit the damage, right? And that's not an acceptable result. Just cover the spread mindset. I'll never be that guy. You play to win the game. Oh, Herm Edwards, get him in here. That's working out great. Arizona State, isn't it? You got to go in attacking. South Carolina's only chance to win the game is Spencer Rattler plays out of his mind, right? That Georgia has busts in coverage or they just get beat and Carolina hits on all of their opportunities. Because you saw a bunch of opportunities against Arkansas, and I get it, Arkansas's defense is not Georgia. But the offensive line protected well enough to allow Spencer Rattler to get the ball down the field. And Rattler can do it a lot better than most quarterbacks because he can do it on the run, and he just flicks that thing, man, and it goes 45 yards like it's nothing for him. It's crazy. DC, why do you do that to yourself, man? If South Carolina would have somehow beat Arkansas, game day would be in Columbia this Saturday. You got to let it go, man. Got to let it go. Improvement in the running game, no major injuries, getting Van, Xavier Legette, and Takarion Joyner involved in the offense. That's what the Tonester would like to see. He says that's an acceptable result. That doesn't seem like a result. That seems like just some things you want to see. Chris says, don't get blown out. Score some touchdowns this weekend. Georgia's only allowed 3 points in the first 2 games. Yeah. I think South Carolina will score. Carolina typically plays up to Georgia, right? They just do. They just always have. Typically. Jason says a lot of offense talk, but the run defense was the bigger problem Saturday, right? Now with 2 huge injuries, yikes. I don't think, not in my opinion, Jason. I think the run defense was about what it was. I thought they did a decent job. What, they made it stop on 4th and 1, right? Arkansas is going to run over everybody, near everybody this year. So that's why I don't think it was a bigger problem than the offense, especially the run game of the offense. Being one-dimensional when you don't have elite talent or execution or a system, especially in the SEC, you're in big trouble. Okay, Craig says, and I mean to try to run it sparingly. I agree we are a passing team. So if you're going to tell me that, Craig, then I don't disagree, right? You got your tight ends out there. You try to keep them in to help, and you take your shots. I think Jaheim Bell will have an advantage in the pass game. And the fact that he got 0 catches against Arkansas, mystifying, right? And that is the unfair thing we do as fans, I think, in a lot of ways. Maybe I guess you could consider it fair, but it's part of what it is in 2022. You go into a season where you go into the transfer portal, you add some pieces, right? Then you have to make sure, as an offensive coordinator, those pieces turn into production. I don't think Marcus Satterfield gets as much credit for Austin Stogner having a good game as he does blame for Jaheim Bell not having a good game. And that's not really fair, but it is reality. I think we probably unfairly say, all right, look at all these pieces. Oh, you got to operate at a really high level and score a bunch of points, get a bunch of yards. Otherwise, you're not doing enough with what you got. The meal is not living up to the groceries if we're going to go Bill Parcells. Chris says, give the O-line a little credit. A couple of those sacks were on Rattler getting tripped up or running into D linemen. Well, you got away from some sacks too. You can't get. I thought the offensive line, what are we going to go letter grade? C against Arkansas. I don't think you give anything better than that. And when your coach comes into a post-game press conference, says your offensive line plays better and you're a C, you're not going to win a lot of SEC games unless you get some big-time breaks, unless you get a couple of punts blocked for touchdown. Oh, Kens, I can guarantee you're going to see that. I think you got to jack that number up. Let Rattler throw it 34 to 40. Or excuse me, I can't even read. 35 to 40 times. Fake field goal, fake punt, try it all. Well, you certainly can't hold anything back. Good morning to you too, Hope. But I don't think you're gonna trick Georgia into losing this game. You just have to hit on all of your opportunities, and they got to miss theirs. A lot like that. What was that? That was in the fourth quarter, I think. Arkansas just wide open. Looked like it would be a touchdown. Wasn't even a catch down the sideline in the middle of the Carolina or in between defenders, I should say. You got to have something, some multiple things like that happen for Georgia. And I think you got to do something that the Gamecocks have rarely done against big-time teams and have a good first quarter. You got to get the crowd going. As that noon game is, we all know what it is at Williams-Brice Stadium in September. It is a challenge to get the crowd going if things aren't going well, especially. Craig says Arkansas is probably the worst matchup in the SEC for us, including Alabama and Georgia. They just do what we can't defend, and most teams can't defend Arkansas. Well, yeah, that's why I thought it was just a bad matchup going in. Talked to Corey Miller about that. That's why I did not expect Carolina to win the game or even cover the spread. Georgia's a little different, right? I don't know of many coaches who are more qualified to know what Georgia's going to do than former Georgia assistant under Kirby Smart, Shane Beamer. No surprises. A lot like Sam Pittman knew exactly what Carolina was going to do, especially on special teams, having hired Shane Beamer's former analyst there at Georgia to run their special teams. And we saw a tremendous special teams unit after game number 1 not play well, played poorly in game number 2. So if you transfer that logic, hey, man, maybe Shane Beamer can really coach them up and make Georgia look a little bit ugly. I'd say not likely, right? Georgia is where I had them. Their total offense right now is number 10 in the country. And that's playing Oregon in the first game and then a sleepwalking through Sanford in game number 2. I mean, I say sleepwalking just because they didn't put up 100 like they could have. It was still never in doubt and nowhere close to where other like Alabama and Texas, and I know Sanford's not a fair comparison to Texas, but nothing like Texas A&M or Notre Dame or Nebraska over the weekend. So we'll continue to talk plenty of Gamecocks. Wanted to see if you guys checked out Monday Night Football at all last night. In my opinion, Peyton and Eli, Monday night's best show on television. Not even close. Was watching it last night. I think I got to it about the middle of the third quarter. So good. Last night is exactly why it's really good. So Joel McHale, who I'm a fan of to a certain degree. I like that show Community. And he was on like Talk Soup back in the day. He's a comedian, but actually did walk on and play tight end at Washington back in the day and always makes fun of himself for being a terrible football player. He was on with them in the third quarter, and then Shannon Sharp was on in the fourth quarter. It was fantastic. A lot like this show off the top today. The audio wasn't working great for Shannon Sharp off the top, and so Eli comes on and says, hey, we're going to get that fixed. And Shannon pops back on, and he's got his bottle with him. He's taking a couple swigs last night. He's a former Bronco, obviously pulling for the Broncos. Broncos and Seahawks was a really good game last night, or a really close game, I should say. Russell Wilson played against his old team at the old stadium. first game with the Broncos, Peyton Manning was talking about, man, it was a year and like 8 games in before he went back and played at Indianapolis, and they showed the clip of him and getting the standing ovation and being emotional and the whole thing. And Eli was making fun of him for crying. The fact that you have a brother dynamic, and the brothers just happen to be 2 of the best NFL quarterbacks of all time, guys who are willing to take shots and not take themselves too seriously. And then you get on the guests that they do, and all this while the game is going on. It's fantastic. I love it. And then what happened at the end of last night's game? I get it. You're not an NFL person. I get it. If this is all about college football for you right now, but you need to be aware of what happened last night, if only to have some context about your head coach and his ability to manage the clock down the stretch. So it was an interesting spot. Down 1, Russell Wilson and the Denver Broncos get the ball back about 4 minutes to go last night. And it's about at the 20-ish yard line, I think, maybe a little bit better. So all they need to do is go down and kick a field goal. So a little tricky, right? Because you don't want to kick a field goal too soon, or you don't want to take the lead too soon in the NFL. So many times that turns into the other team winning the football game. Now, Geno Smith hasn't done that exactly a bunch with Seattle. So I would argue you shouldn't have been too concerned about that, overly concerned about that last night. They had only scored 17 points in the game. It's not like you can't trust your defense to do a little something there. But I thought Seattle was playing it at the perfect pace. And it comes up in the conversation, like, when do you go to the 2-minute offense? Peyton Manning brings up. And Eli, in classic little brother fashion, is 2-minute warning? Or Eli might have asked it and Peyton might have answered it. I don't know for sure. But that's how it came up, like with 2 minutes. And they all kind of agreed with Shannon Sharp there as well. You don't want to go too fast. You want to take your time. Russell Wilson looked in total control of the game. The narrative was completely set up. The storyline was there for him. Ball in his hands, gotten paid, $256 million or whatever it was by the Broncos. Clearly, Seattle didn't think he was worth that. Shannon Sharp mentioned he'd been through it as well, specifically in Denver, I think, too, how when a team does not continue its relationship with you, doesn't invest in you, it is personal when you return. So even though Russell Wilson was saying, yeah, great memories and no hard feelings and all of that, in the back of your mind, Peyton Manning agreeing with this, even though he was very publicly gracious with Indianapolis and the whole thing, it's a personal deal for these guys. It was personal for Russell Wilson to win that game. So they moved the ball relatively well. Inside of 2 minutes, right around midfield, no big hurry, 3 timeouts left. It gets to a 3rd and 19, I think. A bad play, 3rd and 19. They pick up about 15 yards to make it 4th and 5 with about 45 seconds to go. Peyton Manning says, I think I'd take a timeout here. 4th and 5, right around midfield. And then Eli and Shannon Sharp agreeing, taking a timeout. You got plenty of timeouts left, but the clock is not on your side if you let it run all the way down and just watching it run. And Peyton Manning was like, I'd take a timeout like now. 35 seconds, 30, tick, tick, tick. They line up. Eli's saying, oh, these guys don't know what they're doing. They're not set. Cortland Sutton, they don't. And they finally call a timeout to avoid the delay of game penalty at 20 seconds. And then they send the field goal unit on to attempt one of the longest field goals in the history of football. 64-yarder. Brandon McManus. Instead of trusting in the guy that you paid $250 million in Russell Wilson, they decided a trot out Brandon McManus for a 64-yard field goal. And the Seahawks call a timeout on the first field goal attempt. So he gets a practice kick, and he pulled it a little bit left, but had plenty of leg. And then The actual kick, I believe, doinked off that left upright. And now the new Denver coach getting crucified for his clock management. Because I think even if he had made that thing, I don't think you say, wow, that was a genius move. Gutsy. I mean, you would say gutsy for sure. Ballsy play. You won the football game. Winner gets the spoils. I don't think he would have gotten nearly as much credit as he is now getting blame. It was fascinating to watch. But that's, to me, what the NFL is, right? Especially not being invested in that nearly as much as college football. Being able to enjoy it for the high level, extreme competition it is, and then not having too much personally invested. Fantastic to watch. Watching it with Peyton and Eli and Shannon Sharp, it's a blast. So what they've done by putting those guys in that spot on Monday night, making that show what it is, has completely changed my opinion of Monday Night Football, which I thought had become pretty irrelevant, being not even close to the Sunday night games from a competitive standpoint. Great stuff last night on Monday Night Football, making me that much more thankful football season is in full swing, which is why I can't get on board too much with doom and gloomers. After yesterday's news became official, Jordan Strawn and Mo Kaba out for the season, torn ACLs, Gamecock starters on defense. Obviously, just brutal news for those guys. He put so much blood, sweat, and tears into everything. Kaba had a knee injury in high school as well that he had overcome, and then he had won the starting job, right? Looked like he was poised for a good season. Obviously going to be an important piece to the Gamecock defense, was important to that Gamecock run defense in the Arkansas game. But both of those guys go down. When Shane Beamer said it doesn't look good after the game, can kind of see this coming, unfortunately. But again, this is why I think you had to have this is part of the reason why you had to have a realistic. You could be optimistic. 7-5, I think, was still optimistic from the Gamecock standpoint going into this season. 8-4 was really optimistic, I think. Anything after that is just pie in the sky. When you look at it from an analysis standpoint. And this is part of the reason why, right? It's not just about having good players. It's about having good players behind good players. Carolina's thin at linebacker. Unproven on the edge. It looks like Jordan Birch has significantly improved. I think through the first couple of games, let's go ahead and put up the defensive stats for Carolina individually. Jordan Birch is at the top of the list. 15 total tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, and a sack. I don't think you could ask for much more from your third-year, 5-star guy that I think it's fair to say hadn't lived up to the expectations through the first couple of seasons. It's that second guy that's fascinating to see on this list, isn't it? You got true freshman safety Nick Emenwari, second in the team in tackles at 14. Zach Pickens, massive. So you got your 2 5-star guys, 2 out of your top 3 tacklers through 2 games this season. Zach Pickens, interior defensive lineman, 3rd in tackles, a tremendous sign. Jordan Strawn, unfortunately, is 5th on that list. He had gotten a sack this year as well. And Mo Kaba, not even, I guess he's down on the list. What is that, about 10th or so? So now you got to have backups step up. Your depth is tested. It's just when you look on paper going into this season, returning guys, returning production, and then evaluating transfers or incoming freshmen, South Carolina didn't stack up towards the top of the league. They just didn't. You want to tell me somewhere in the middle? I would tell you somewhere around that 10 to 12 range, I think, was the fair way to evaluate the rosters coming in. Now, you want to say 3 through 13 were really bunched together. I would say, okay, I disagree with, I think you got to go at least 5. I think you had to put Kentucky and Arkansas at 3, 4 coming back. Tennessee right in there, that mix. Florida maybe not too far behind just from a personnel standpoint. But I think you make the argument that South Carolina was relatively close. Now we're going to see. Right now is when you get tested and then some. I mean, worst case scenario, really, in a lot of ways, right? You lose the game at Arkansas. You lose 2 defensive starters going into the game against the number 1 defending national champs. Not what you wanted to see. But again, part of just what makes college football so difficult, what makes South Carolina football specifically so difficult. You knew the schedule going in. The schedule gets much more favorable after this week. That's the good sign, right? Get a couple of glorified warm-up games with Charlotte and South Carolina State before hitting the 6-game stretch. I think it is after that. Yeah, 6-game SEC stretch. That will determine the story of the season, by and large, assuming there's not a big-time upset pulled against Clemson. Long way to go to get there. And I know on this show specifically, first ever first-round draft pick from the University of South Carolina, Rick Sanford, has told us that he thinks the gap is closed and South Carolina's quarterback is better than Clemson's, and that's where he sees the rivalry, and he'll be able to tell us more when he joins us, set to join us in about a little bit more than 10 minutes or so today. Interested in hearing his thoughts for sure. And we'll get to hear his thoughts, I guess, for the first time on this show about South Carolina's season so far. He was out of the country last week. But as I dramatically sip my water, interested to hear his take, especially as a defensive back. Watching both teams really last week, Carolina try to stop that Arkansas defense, the Arkansas secondary being outmanned, a couple of starters down, and what Spencer Rattler and Juice Wells specifically were able to do. So let's go to offensive stats here. We'll go to individual ones first. And man, you see the 2.0. That's the number that sticks out to me in these offensive stats for the Gamecocks, averaging 2 yards per carry. And you want to tell me that a lot of that is you want to take out the sacks, and that's not fair. Okay, but every other college football team is also dealing with that. And Rattler's been sacked 9 times. I think the Gamecocks just have 2 in a couple of games. Those are tough stats. I mean, I never would have thought 2 games into the season, no South Carolina running back would have, no South Carolina rusher, because Jaheim Bell, not necessarily a running back, would have more than 53 yards running. That's a tough one, man. Those are tough numbers from the rushing standpoint. Receiving standpoint, pretty good, right? Juice Wells averaging 122 per game. Pretty fantastic. Jalen Brooks averaging near 60 yards per game. Surprising, I think, is a fair way to say that. He's played great. Jaheim Bell only having 4 catches and 18 yards in the past game is surprising, especially after the last time we saw him last year, just running all over North Carolina. And Josh Vann, equally surprising, I would say, with just 1 catch on the season through 2 games. You guys taking anything big away from those numbers outside of what I mentioned? Steven weighing in, Facebook live stream this morning. I got no problem. The schedule layout, but with Carolina rebuilding the team, do you think it would help if they put the more winnable games at the beginning of the season to get momentum, then play the harder games later, or just leave the schedule like it is? Well, part of that is not up to Carolina, right? The SEC gives you your schedule. Good luck. So I think from that standpoint, Carolina did all it could do with its non-conference games at the beginning of the year. 3 out of the first 5, right? By my math. Georgia State, South Carolina State, Charlotte. You can't front load it any better than that. The SEC part of that schedule, you could absolutely have gotten more favors from the conference. Vandy and Missouri had been their first 2 games instead of Arkansas and Georgia. Boy, we'd be talking a lot different, wouldn't we? And yeah, absolutely, that would have been better for this team with Spencer Rattler coming in as quarterback, playing for the first time in a Carolina uniform, with Marcus Satterfield having more pieces, still trying to develop an offensive identity a year plus in, dealing with all the quarterback flux of last year. So absolutely, Stephen, in a perfect world, that's how it would have been for South Carolina, but we won't spend much time talking about it because that's not what it is. And you could probably make the argument as well, could ultimately be a good thing for Carolina going through early adversity. Like Shane Beamer said after the game on Saturday, there was a lot of it against Arkansas. And so now maybe when some future games get in the balance, ideally you hope Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida, maybe you can have some of that experience to rely on, or take a little bit more confidence than you could have otherwise if you were just being successful against teams who just aren't very good. So we'll see. You never know how that plays out. The flip side of that would be that injuries continue to mount up, and depth is an issue, and you have trouble just competing against those teams that you thought were going to be toss-ups going into the season. But those teams are playing physical football games as well. Those teams will have their share of injuries. To me, that's why it's never an excuse. Sometimes it's an explanation, but it's never an excuse. All SEC teams know they're going to deal with it, and that's why you got to recruit how you got to recruit at South Carolina, which seems to be where things are for Shane Beamer and company. I think from a fan standpoint, that's why it's important to recognize your continued support is a factor in the program. It's why fans can take some pride in recruiting rankings or having guys, big-time players, even consider your program. Being in the mix for big-time players like South Carolina is that Nicholas Harbor is the 5-star guy from up in the DMV area that they're looking to kind of solidify. They would love to add him to a class that's already 15th, 16th, I think, somewhere right around there, most of the national recruiting rankings. The environment at Georgia, I get it if you're a Gamecock fan and you're disappointed or you're maybe even slightly disillusioned, discouraged. But if you're going to be a good fan, you got to get over that. Get by it, man. It's done. Always, it's one of my favorite things to do with my son's teams. They're 9-7. But I always ask them, what's the most important play? You get some weird looks. But I try to drill into them most important play is the next play. Doesn't matter what the sport is, just how you got to change your mindset, right? That's the most important play. Most important thing now for Carolina, obviously, the cliche is the next game. But from a fan standpoint, I thought it was massively impressive to have 78,000 plus as the official attendance. Game number 1, season number 2, Georgia State, September 3rd, 7:30. I thought that was a tremendous performance by Gamecock fans. Everyone associated with that, right? The $18 tickets. I knew a buddy who'd never been down to the game. He's got a couple of young kids too. He's like, yeah, $18 tickets, man. Another buddy's like, yep. A brother coming down, we got the $18 tickets. Like it was a smart move. It's what you have to do in 2022 to get people in your stadium. It's part of it. The LED lights, tremendous presentation, the publicity that came off of that, social media-wise, especially, what you got to do. You don't have to do that to get people to Georgia, but what you do need to have, and certainly we'll hear this from Shane Beamer, I'm sure, today. Weekly press conference. I'm sure we'll hear it from the players beforehand, right? Arkansas game's done. Now it's on to Georgia. And we're looking forward to the challenge. Playing against the best is why you come to school and all the cliches, right? But from the fan standpoint, to anything you can do to get close to, no, not even get close, right? If you're going to the Carolina-Georgia game, you're going to be invested. But it's different with that 24.5-point spread. I get it. Being there, being fully behind your team after a disappointing result, doing it at noon in September against the number one team in the country, showing some of those prospects who will be in Williams-Brice Stadium for the very first time what a Saturday at Williams-Brice is all about is plenty of motivation, I think, for a lot of Gamecock fans. And then you want to put that into your mind, the possibility of pulling a massive upset. It could happen. I mean, you can't talk Carolina, Georgia without acknowledging what happened in Athens a couple of years ago. It was a much more unlikely scenario than what could happen this Saturday, right? I mean, Spencer Rattler is one of the most talented quarterbacks in the country. South Carolina clearly has guys who can make plays on the outside. They can make those plays against Georgia. They can. Now, it's not likely that they do it consistently and do it to where they're going to put up a bunch of points and beat Georgia, but it's possible. And, I mean, if Will Muschamp can beat Georgia on the road when they're a top 5 team, certainly this 2022 version of Carolina can beat Georgia. Not likely, can. And so you got to go in with the mindset that it could happen. Ryan says 4 rushing touchdowns in 2 games. Improvement from last year. Good stuff. York, good to have you in here as we get towards hour number 2 on the program. Good to hear from you. How you guys doing? How are you doing this morning, York, specifically? Season standpoint, September 13th. Still digesting maybe what you saw against Arkansas. Maybe you've moved completely past that. You're ready to talk more Georgia. I think because of how pivotal a win could have been at Arkansas, might be taking Gamecock fans a little bit longer to get over than typically. I think that's a great sign, right? I think that means you convinced yourself. You were able to be convinced. You saw some things. You saw 21-16 after a brutal start, weathered the storm, right back in the football game, knowing if you win that thing, you're probably going to be a top 25 team. You take that momentum into Georgia, that spread would be down certainly in the teens, right? If Carolina would have gone on to win that game, maybe more like 10. But we know that didn't happen. Chris, anything's possible. That's why we play the game. Cliche, I know. LOL. Yeah. But also, it's a cliche for a reason, right? York says, great. I feel great where I thought we'd be. Just need to compete more, cut little mistakes out, make catches and tackles. Compete more, maybe offensive line-wise. Yeah, you shore up the tackling, which I think will naturally happen not playing Arkansas. I think Carolina's made some catches, man. I don't put any blame on. Now, the first game wasn't great from the receiver standpoint, and when you hear, especially after the game, that you got whipped on the perimeter by Georgia State, that's very concerning. But yeah, you got to make catches moving forward, and I'm wondering if Marcus Satterfield and the coaching staff feel like they learned a lot more about the identity of their football team. I think they've shown us through 2 games, with as many times as they've gone empty, that they know the best chance for South Carolina football to win in 2022 is on the shoulders of number 7, their quarterback. They've shown us that, right? You can say whatever you want to say, but I'm believing what I see. And they haven't come out and said, yeah, we're going to be a passing team. We know that Spencer Rattler is different than what we've had before, and he's our best chance to win, so that's what we're going to do. They haven't said that, but they've shown us that. And if it had only happened against Arkansas, that would be one thing. But to have seen that against Georgia State, to not be able to run the ball against Georgia State at home in the opener, I think is really what has cemented that in my mind. Well, but we'll see. That's a great part about college football, where Craig's talking about, no, you line up 2 tight ends, you keep 7 guys on the line there, you try to hit what you can hit against Georgia. That's your best chance. Maybe. That's why we got to have more qualified opinions in the program, and that's what we have right now in the first round draft pick for South Carolina. Rick Sanford, always on the move there from out of the country, on the move again. Rick, great to see you, man.
Great to see you, Tim. Boy, I tell you, that was a tough loss for South Carolina last week.
What did you think overall? To me, it was about how I expected it to play out. Maybe a few more points on both sides from the offenses in that game, and I think South Carolina had a little bit more success in the pass game, especially in that fourth quarter, which was kind of wild and long and took forever and the whole thing. But overall, it was about what I expected. What about you, Rick?
Well, it's hard to say, Tim. I mean, I expect to win every time I step on a football field, regardless, of the matchup or whatever is being said out there. Now, that being said, I thought Arkansas just had better players. I mean, their offensive line, defensive line are just better than South Carolina's right now. And I guess if there's a disappointing part to me for South Carolina is I really thought their defensive line would be better than they are. They just, to be able to they just couldn't stop the run. I mean, they couldn't stop Arkansas from running the football. And the other disappointing, obviously, I mean, we beat a dead horse about the offensive line, but I agree with you. They just can't run the football. I don't know why that's. I think a lot of offensive line play takes a lot of physicality, and maybe they're just not physical enough. I don't know. I mean, it kind of defies logic when you've got that many, starting players coming back as you had from last year. And you had some success, with the running game last year, but it doesn't seem like it's there right now.
No, it definitely is not. And, returning starters sometimes aren't necessarily a great thing if the production wasn't really there. Or, I think to not see any progress in year number 2 from the run game is the major concern for Gamecock fans offensively. Ryan asked a pretty decent question, I think, here. He says, so if we throw for 350 yards, run for 75 yards, but win against an SEC program other than Vandy, are we still concerned about the rushing stats? What do you think? To me, it comes down to, you're still concerned because you're basically conceding that you're not as physical as other teams, and that's just not what you want to have. What about you from the former players team?
I agree with you, Tim. I think you have to run the football to be able to open up your passing game. When you get yourself, you're exposing your quarterback back there when they know you're going to have to throw the football. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that you're exposing Rattler, and and if he goes down, I can tell you it's not going to be pretty. For the rest of this season. I've been impressed with him, honestly. I don't think there's anything more that he could have done over the first couple of games. I'm just very disappointed in the offensive line play, and honestly, I'm disappointed in the front 7 play. Also on the defensive side of the football. I know Arkansas's got a good running game. I know they're physical up front. I know all that, but maybe it's time to buckle your chin strap a little bit, on defense, and let's get after some people, and don't let people push you around like that. I know they're a big group of guys. I know they're big and physical, but to me, I just don't understand, why you're getting pushed around the way you are with some of the players and the accolades that some of these guys had coming to South Carolina at the time. So I think somebody needs to have a come to Jesus meeting over there on defense as well and say, look, guys, I mean, we just got ran for 300 yards up front on us. That's inexcusable in my opinion. I don't care who you're playing.
Good stuff there. I can hear the former player in you right now, Rick. I can hear those halftime conversations you might have with your teammates back in the day. Chris is with you on Facebook, says our D-line, the perfect example of how the star ratings really don't matter. I think Jordan Burch has shown me why he's a 5-star guy. Zach Pickens has produced from a number standpoint. I get it that Arkansas certainly pushed South Carolina around. I just put Arkansas way up there. I think they're going to do that to everybody this year, Rick. And I thought South Carolina's defense did enough, by and large, to keep them in the game to some degree. I guess it's a matter of expectations. If you take up the approach that, you should go win the game, then I hear exactly what you're saying, man.
Well, I understand if you're limited, Tim, and I get all that. I think that when you look at these star ratings that they put on players coming out of high school, I think sometimes those things get a little bit skewed. Being a 5-star guy means you should be making plays every down, quite honestly. You shouldn't be, making a flash here in the pan, one play and then letting the guy run over you 3 more plays. It just, to me, that doesn't equate to being a 5-star athlete. Okay, you've got to be able to make plays if you're a 5-star player, and I don't see enough of the 5-star guys at South Carolina making enough of those plays. Quite honestly, I mean, if you're that big and tough up front on defense, let's go prove it. Let's go prove it, and you should be able to prove it against those guys at Arkansas. I don't, that just doesn't equate to me. If you're a 5-star guy and you're playing 4 and 5-star guys, you should be able to hold your own. And I didn't see that last week. That was really surprising to me. I guess the offensive line wasn't that much of a surprise, honestly. But to get pushed around on defense the way South Carolina got pushed around, that was the surprising part to me, their front seven.
Rick Sanford joining us en route, doing it every Tuesday this football season. Great to hear your feedback, Rick. I guess overall, through a couple of games, didn't get to talk to you after that Georgia State game as well. To me, that was much more of a concern than what you're talking about. When Arkansas does something to you, it's one thing. When Georgia State holds you to 2.5 yards per carry, I feel like that is just a massive alarm going off. That's been the biggest surprise to me through 2 games, the lack of Carolina running the football, and the biggest concern. Are you with me on that?
I'm definitely with you. I think that is a huge concern. I think you have to, in order to throw the football effectively, I think you have to open up a running game. You've got to have some type of balance. I mean, you can be, lean one way more toward the run or more toward the pass. Yes, that's fine. I understand that. But you've got to be able to establish some type of running game up front in order to do what you want to on offense. And I understand what Coach Beamer was saying, well, we had guys, that didn't block well on the outside. And, I get all that. And that may be true. Okay. But you've got to be able to move the ball between the tackles. And South Carolina just has not shown any ability whatsoever to do that. The only thing I can think of, Tim, and I don't want to push the massive alarm button yet, but I think maybe a guy like McDowell maybe can open up some things for you because he's so darn quick and lateral in his movements. That might be able to help your running game, giving him a little bit more time back there and running the football. I just don't know. I just don't know physically if they're going to be able to match some of the teams that they're going to have, of course, Georgia, number 1 in the country. I just don't know how in the world they're going to match Georgia physically up front. And, they'll get away with it with UNC Charlotte and South Carolina State, I believe. But once SEC teams come in here, it's, we saw what Arkansas did. It doesn't bode well, let's put it for this weekend, unless you can, somehow try to put something together with your offensive line as well as your defensive line.
Yeah, Chris agrees with you, says, I think that Juju did a better job than Marshawn did, talking about running the football. Craig earlier asked a question, and I think it's a fair one to ask. What is satisfactory? What is kind of an acceptable is the word he used. An acceptable result this weekend. How do you see it going in against number one Georgia? It's a 24.5-point spread, man.
Well, I mean, is South Carolina as good as Oregon? I think that's what you got to look at. I think and what did they do to Oregon? I mean, won by 46. So I don't think South Carolina right now is where they want to be. Obviously, I don't think they have the players that Georgia has. And I read some of these messages, and these people making fun of Coach Muschamp coming back and how South Carolina will be close because he's calling the defenses. I just have to chuckle and laugh every time I see that stuff because, Will Muschamp knows defense. I will say that. He does know defense. Now, did he do some things wrong while he was in South Carolina? Obviously he did, okay? I always thought Coach Muschamp should have called the defenses here, quite honestly. And I think that's, where he maybe made, some of the mistakes that he made. But look, he's not as terrible a football coach as a lot of people are making him out to be. I think he knows X's and O's, and he one thing about it, Tim, he's darn sure got good players. So I'll tell you that on defense, they've got some good players. So they're going to present a huge challenge up front on both the offensive side and on the defensive side for South Carolina.
49-3 was the final score. You brought up the Oregon game. You're not telling me that an acceptable result is to be better than 49-3, are you?
Well, I hope it doesn't work out that way. I would hope that this is what we talked about earlier in the season. When you get into a game where you're, let's just be honest. I mean, I think South Carolina's outmanned this weekend. I mean, they're out athleted. Okay, so you got to hope to cause mistakes. You got to do some things that you probably wouldn't do week in and week out. Pull a little bit of trickery here and there. You've got to do some things to try to equalize it and get yourself some plays. And I think South Carolina is going to have to do that in order to try to stay close in this football game. And you got to try to, create some turnovers. That's your big thing. If you can get, I think it'll take a minimum of 3 to 4 turnovers to get yourself close into the fourth quarter in this game. I do think Georgia's going to be able to move the football. I mean, if Arkansas can move it, I guarantee you Georgia can move it. So, as to whether South Carolina can move the football is going to be the big question to me. And how are you going to protect Spencer Rattler back there this week? This is a huge challenge. I think Georgia is the best football team in the country. I don't think there's any doubt they're better than Alabama right now. And, I think, the best football is played out of, week in and week out of the SEC. And, for South Carolina to keep this thing close, you're going to have to create some things. Got to go positive for you this week, and you got to create some turnovers and do those type things, Tim.
I'm interested in your perspective on that, being the former defensive back in both college and the NFL. Do you play differently in a game like that? Or aren't these just a result of, sometimes bounces go your way and you can't go in and say, hey, guys, we have to force more turnovers, can you? Or do you play a more gambling style of defense and try to make those things happen?
Well, no, you play within your game. I think you have to play the proper techniques, and I think you have to do things that are, important to try to get yourself in position to make plays. What you got to hope for is you be in position to make the plays, and when the ball's tipped up in the air or whatever, you get yourself in position to make those plays. I don't think you do anything a whole lot different in terms of what you're going to do in regards to, pressing and all that. That's not going to help you. But I do think that there is some things that you're going to have to do defensively, Tim, and maybe scheme-wise to try to change up in this game. Maybe more blitzing than South Carolina's done before, at the opportune times. When you've got them backed up, maybe inside their 20 or somewhere in there, maybe you have to blitz a little bit more. Maybe you have to take some chances that you normally wouldn't take against a lesser team. But I think South Carolina, to stay in this game, they're going to have to create some things, and there's a lot of positive things are going to be have to be happening for them in a positive manner.
News going official yesterday. Defensive end Jordan Strawn, linebacker Mo Kaba out for the year with ACL tears. Having been in that locker room, having played with guys that get injured, what kind of effect mentally, emotionally does that take on teammates? And then how do you kind of work through that? Or is that one of those things where you got to completely compartmentalize it, know that it's part of the game, part of the deal, and you just move forward?
Well, you hate it for those guys. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt, you hate it for them, but you have to compartmentalize it and you have to say next man up. I mean, that's the way it is. I mean, you don't have the luxury of waiting, and saying, oh, we're not going to play this week because we're missing a guy here and there. That's the amazing thing about football. It's such a physical game that, you got to line up and you got to play week in and week out. And, you just have to have the attitude that, hey, we're going to support this guy, that's going to be filling in and we're going to do what we can. Hey, he's on scholarship too. So he's got to be decent, we're going to do the best we can with what we got. And I just think a lot of it this week is going to be put on the coaching staff, Tim. In order to keep this game close, they're going to have to create some schemes up front that are somewhat confusing to Georgia. Okay. I mean, I'm talking about doing things that Georgia maybe hasn't seen. They've seen a lot of things. I get that and all that, but you have to create things and you've got to create with your timing, when you're going to come with the blitz. And, you have to remember too, Tim, when you come with a blitz, that means you're leaving guys out there on an island sometime by themselves. So if they pop the play and they get it, hey, they just outmanned you. That's just the way it was. But you got to do things where you got to get guys unblocked and do something defensively until Georgia can figure it out to where you can make yourself some plays.
Man, as you're talking about that, I would think the guy most qualified to do that would be the guy that ran their defense the year before, and that did not work out well for Dan Lanning in Oregon at all. But you're right. You got to do something, and it is staring you in the face, kind of what it is. One of the big surprises as well on the defensive side of the ball this year is the freshman safety who stepped in from Irmo there, Nick Emenwari. What do you make of a guy coming in unheralded? Shane Beamer says, yeah, they beat him out. They didn't beat anybody out for Nick Emenwari. Played linebacker in high school, made the adjustment to safety, and now is second on the team in tackles through 2 games.
Well, he's fortunate. He's had the opportunity to show what he can do, through injury to one of the other players. I think Roderick, is who he's replaced. But I've been impressed. I think he's a sure tackler. He looks like he tackles well. And, in today's game, you better be able to tackle. If you're a safety or a corner, you better be able to tackle people out in space, because that's where the game's played now. It's not played, the end to the end. It's more played out from the wide receiver to the wide receiver. So I've been impressed with him. It's a tough job as a true freshman to come in and do that. I mean, the problem you run into with most freshmen like that is that while they may look great sometimes, they make mistakes sometimes too. And, fortunately, we haven't seen that out of Nick so far. But, you have to remember he's a young player. South Carolina's building this program. Do I think that South Carolina will keep this game close? I mean, I hope they do. But I honestly, I think that, with kids like Emenwari and some of the other young freshmen coming up, I do hope that South Carolina can start closing that gap a little bit with the Georgias and the Clemsons and the Alabamas and the Michigans and those type things. So, but I've been pretty impressed with him. I think he's done a really good job. I haven't seen him that much in coverage, but obviously he was a linebacker, so he should be able to tackle people.
You mentioned when we talked before the season started, you really thought that Carolina is closing the gap with Clemson. You thought, especially at quarterback, Carolina has an advantage there this year, which they haven't had in years past. Now, 2 games in, from my perspective, I haven't seen that gap close. I mean, if it has closed, it's really slight. How do you see it?
Well, I think some positions they've closed the gap. I don't think, overall as a team, I do think, I think South Carolina's got the better quarterback. I really do. I think South Carolina right now has a better quarterback than Clemson. I have not seen enough of Clemson's running game, this year. With I know Shipley is. I don't think he's a 5-star player like they project he is up there. I do think for South Carolina to really close the gap on Clemson, they're going to have to start recruiting defensive linemen, offensive linemen that can, step in and play. I do feel like, the kids coming in for South Carolina, the kid from Dorman, I think, is an excellent football player, that picked South Carolina over Clemson as one of his finalists. So that's the type thing I think at South Carolina you're going to have to do to close down. Let's face it, Tim. You can have all the skill position players in the world. I'll go back to my time in New England when I was playing with the Patriots, and I mean we had 5 first-round draft picks in the secondary in New England. And one year we got ran over because we couldn't stop anybody up front. I mean, we could cover everybody. That wasn't a problem, but people quit throwing the ball against us because they knew they could run the ball because our front 7 wasn't as good as our back 4, or our front 6 wasn't as good as our back 5. So, you've got to have some balance. And I think the games are won up front in football. They just are. I mean, a lot of the flash and making the plays and happens from your defensive backs and your offensive backs and your quarterback. But until you can start being competitive up front with people, you're going to have a hard time winning games consistently.
I think that mindset led Corey Miller, when I was talking to him yesterday, to say that South Carolina's got to go up tempo on offense. It's a way. You look over at Tennessee. He used the example that Josh Heupel and company have been able to kind of maybe overcome some offensive line deficiencies. Do you agree with that philosophy that Carolina's got to go up tempo to have success on offense?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You see, that's something that's different. I think you have to do things that are going to be different against a Georgia. Now, have they ever seen that? I'm sure they've seen that. But the problem when you go up tempo, defensively, it limits them a little bit because they can't substitute. They can't substitute to get the people they want on the field, at that particular time. So, let's just say they go up tempo and, South Carolina gains 4 yards. Well, it's 2nd and 6. When you're up tempo, they can't bring in another defensive back, or they can't, bring in another guy or another linebacker or whatever they would be wanting to do. So I think you have to do that. This goes back to what I say. I think you've got to scheme people a little bit this week. Now, that doesn't mean you can out scheme Georgia. I'm not saying that, okay? Because they've got coaches over there that understand that this is what they're going to try to do to us, and I think they'll try to prepare to the best of their ability to see something different. And I think they're going to have to do the heck. They're number 1 in the country. There's a reason for that. They got great players and they got guys that can coach over there. So. I don't think it's going to be anything you're going to, shock them with. But one thing you want to do is you want to try to limit them. You don't want them to be able to put players on the field, at will, just getting in the huddle all the time, doing those type things. Same thing defensively. I think you've just going to have to do things different on defense. And you got to play solid when you're playing your solid defense. You're going to have to do things against this team that they're not used to. I mean, 24.5 points is a lot of points, Tim. That's a lot of points. I mean, you're talking almost 4 touchdowns here. So I mean, South Carolina, you can't go in there and expect to huddle up and we're just going to run it down their throat. That is just not going to happen. Let's just be honest, okay? So, barring Georgia just completely falling apart and collapsing, I don't see that happening on Saturday.
Sure. South Carolina right now 125th through 2 games in rush yards out of 131. The total offense is down at 95. To me, as I say it, Rick, it's very similar to what we saw last year offensively. Where are you kind of evaluating a year and 2 games in? To me, that's been the massive disappointment, I think, in the Shane Beamer era. I think it's fair to say. Now, probably had less to work with maybe offensively than defensively, but the Marcus Satterfield situation running the offense, how do you see it?
Well, I don't really know. I don't think you have to change coaches all the time, but I think you have to do things different. I think you have to, Marcus Satterfield, like I said, he's going to have to come up with something offensively in order to run the football this week. You've got to be able to run the football on people. You just cannot consistently beat people anymore unless you can do things offensively to predicate what they're going to do on defense. I mean, they'll just stack people up in there. They'll put 7, 8 guys up in the box for you, and you're just not going to be able to run the football. So I think first of all, you're outmanned, and then they're stacking the box on you. So, and you're out talented. So those 3 things do not bode well for South Carolina. Therein lies the reason that you got to do some things different. I think, knowing the limitations that they have offensively right now, I think they're going to try to do something in the passing game more so this week than try to run it on Georgia. I don't think you can run it on them. I haven't seen anything. You tell me, Tim, if you've seen anything up front that's been positive after 2 games, and now you're playing one of the best fronts in the country defensively. I mean, I don't see how in the world South Carolina's going to be able to run the football. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but I just don't see it. So you better start, figuring out how we're going to protect Rattler this week and hope he throws for about 350 or 400 yards, because I don't think that they'll be able to consistently run the football, because I've not seen them be able to run it the first 2 weeks on lesser opponents.
Oh, it'd be the most ridiculous thing ever, right? You can't run it against Georgia State, but you can run it against Georgia in 2022. But
I don't see it. I mean, so that's why I say I think they need to do some different things in the passing game. Screens, those type things, quick screens, quick slants. Even throw the ball deep. I mean, you got to get it. You got to loosen them up. I mean, you're going to have to do some. This is a game, in my opinion, that if they can protect Rattler and give him a chance to make plays, then South Carolina can make some plays and they can get some points on the board. That kid's a special quarterback, but he's going to have some kind of time back there in order to be able to do the things that they're going to do. To try to keep this thing close.
Have you been impressed with the wide receivers so far, with what Juice Wells did last week, what Jalen Brooks did in both the games? I've been impressed with what we've seen from South Carolina. Surprised that Josh Vann hasn't done anything, and Jaheim Bell not necessarily effective in the past game. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag there. But overall, I've been impressed with those guys that didn't make plays for Carolina last year, by and large.
Yeah, I've been impressed with that, Tim. This is a game, if you ask me, I think the Van is the best receiver they have. Okay. I think that you've got to figure out ways in a game like this coming up to get him the football. Okay. I mean, you got to get him the football and get it in his hands. Also Bell, I think, whether it be screens out of the backfield, I think he very much reminds me in some ways physically of Deebo Samuel. Now he's not Deebo. I don't care what I know all these NFL scouts are coming in, and Deebo probably did him the greatest favor in the world, by playing at South Carolina. And now they got a guy that, physically somewhat resembles him, but he's not Deebo Samuel. Okay. Deebo Samuel's come along once in a while. Okay. I think he's got some of the same traits and skill sets that Deebo does, but to put him in Deebo's category right now is not doing him justice. I don't think you need to have that type of expectation. I know he's a projected high round pick and all that, but I don't see the same traits of some of the same things that Deebo. Deebo could return kicks. Deebo could do, he could catch passes. I mean, you just see what he does every Sunday now. or Monday night. So you see what Debo can do. All right. I don't know that you can say Jaheim Bell is Debo Samuel, because I don't think he is.
Well, that bowl game performance raised a bunch of expectations, and Chris hit us up, right? Says, got to put a scheme together like we did in the bowl game. I think that's kind of right on in a lot of ways, that you have to pull something out of your hat.
Yep.
To carry on Joyner going 9 for 9 in that ball game was certainly something out of the hat, right? And this is a guy who played meaningful snaps in that upset win that I still can't figure out, Rick, which I think is probably the biggest piece of evidence that Gamecock fans have right now to be optimistic about this game at all, is that, hey, you went into Athens several years ago with a probably less talented team and still pulled out a win somehow. So it can happen. Not likely, but it can happen. And
but remember, how did it happen, Tim? Go back and remember how it happened.
Pick six helped a lot.
Interceptions, the 3 interceptions by the one kid, you remember?
Yep,
that was 3 turnovers in itself there. And I think they turned it over 1 or 2 more times. And at the end of that game, what happened, Tim? They were still in the game. Georgia was still in the game. And that's why I say, you better be able to force 4 to 5 turnovers this weekend if you want to still be in the game toward the end of the game. Because you are physically outmanned this week. Okay. You are out talented. You are outmanned. Okay. So you've got to come up with something that can try to put your players in position to make some type of plays that can keep you close. I'll tell you the one thing offensively, if they could do it, I don't think they can do it, quite honestly, but if they're able, you watch for this, Tim, if they can control the clock, okay, to keep Georgia from getting the football, you have to control the clock. But what does that entail? You have to run the football to control the clock. South Carolina hasn't been able to run the football. So they have got to run the football in some form or fashion to mix it in with a bunch of passing that I expect to see this weekend, because I think Shane Beamer's not stupid. He's a smart guy. He's a smart coach. How can I get my players in a position to make plays? The way to be able to do that is to spread the field out. Okay, you're going to have to spread the field out and hopefully, run screens, run draws, do things that and hopefully when you call those plays, Georgia's in a defense that's not going to work on that particular down.
I think you just described the main challenge of 2022 from an offensive perspective for South Carolina football, and just from a team perspective, right? Maybe your best opportunity is probably to run some tempo. Right? Yeah. Keep the defense off the field. You run tempo and you don't get first downs. You run your defense right back onto the field, and they get worn down, that we've seen over and over again in the last several years from a South Carolina perspective. So what can you do other than that to have some success and control that clock like you're talking about? To me, that is you have to execute at a much higher level. Almost every single chance you got to move those chains, man, you got to be able to do it. And that's playing a near perfect game, which we certainly have not seen yet through 2 games from the game perspective.
And the other thing is, when you're controlling the clock, Tim, here's the other part of controlling the clock that I don't think fans probably notice as much. But do not snap the football until 28, 29 seconds have gone off the clock, okay? That's how you control the clock, and then you get first downs, okay? It's not about, we'll throw a quick screen out there and then line back up, okay? You can still do that and keep Georgia from substituting, but use the clock to your advantage when you have that opportunity on offense. Eat up as much time as you can, because as much time as you can eat up, that gives Georgia an opportunity to not have the football, and you don't want them having the football. So I expect some up-tempo, and I think that's a really good idea. But I also expect up-tempo by controlling the clock. Okay, you have to eat up the time on the clock.
So is it fair to say number one most important stat in this game, turnovers?
Yes.
By and large. Number
Yeah.
2 most important stat. You going total first downs or time of possession, or is that kind of hand in hand? That's what I was hearing. Both of those things massively important.
Well, I think they both go hand in hand. I mean, if you're getting first downs, you're controlling the clock. I mean, you're moving the chains and you're still out on the field with your offense. But I do expect, if this is my football team, I'm going to eat up as much time as I can on Saturday. I'm going to try to minimize them substituting on me. I'll go up tempo against them. And I think that's a good idea that both you and Corey came up with. I think you have to go up tempo. Fine. You can do that without them substituting, okay? But you got to use the clock to your advantage. Don't go back out there and snap it after 10 seconds again, okay? Just run your plays. Don't huddle, okay? And give them the time. Just line up on the football. Use the clock, okay? Let the clock run down and then run your play, okay? And I think that, in my opinion, I think you when you're outmanned, you're out-talented, you got to come up with something that's going to be to your advantage. If you're getting first downs and you're using the clock, that's to your advantage. And that to me would be my game plan. I've got to go in there. I've got to try to get my players on par with what Georgia can do to us. Okay. We're not physically, we're not talented as this football team is right now, but I'll find a way. And that's what good coaches do. That's what really good coaches do. They find ways to try to equalize football games, okay? And I'll be very interested to see what South Carolina's game plan approach is going to be against the number 1 team in the country.
So I'm a little slow. When I hear up tempo, I think it's like a hurry up offense, but it took me a little while. I think I got it. You're talking about tempo. You run a play, then you line right back up on the ball immediately, like you're going up tempo, and yet you don't hike the ball. You look back over. Maybe you do it a time or two to keep them honest from running guys out there, right? You get a certain look you're looking for, but otherwise you're looking back over. Spencer Rattler's telling everybody to calm down. He's checking it all out and letting that clock run. That makes
Let the clock run. Read the defense. If you have to change the play, okay, change the play. You got plenty of time. But what are you doing when you do that, Tim? Just keep this in mind. Georgia can't substitute if you're on the football. They can't. You can't do that. Okay, you're not going to give them time to be able to do that. So I think that would give you an opportunity to make plays, okay, or certainly keep it out of their hands where they can't make plays. I think you got to use as much of that clock as you can. Time of possession will be vital for South Carolina. If they want to win this football game, they're going to have a big time of possession.
Interesting, for sure. I think that seems like a sound strategy in a lot of ways. Chris mentions that Carolina had a better secondary for that game at Georgia. I think he's absolutely right, especially if Cam Smith can't play in the upper body injury with J.C. Horn and Israel Mukuamu. From the defensive player standpoint, this was kind of what Corey was saying, being a bigger guy like he was. You run that up tempo and you get guys with hands on their hips and the whole thing. Did you see a lot of up tempo back in the day when you were playing, or is that more of a
in pro football we did more so than in college game. But in pro football, I mean, you have to be prepared for everything. I mean, it's we saw it a lot, particularly back in the Chargers, with Dan Fouts. They ran a lot of that, and they were very, 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 very good, as a matter of fact, at it. But yeah, we saw it, and we saw it some with San Francisco, with Montana. He used to run it a little bit, and kind of a crazy story I could give you, Tim, is that we played the 49ers in San Francisco, and it was one of Joe Montana's first starts. Steve DeBerg had been the quarterback, and we had seen them all week with Roger Craig running. This was like the 13th game of the season, okay, in 19, I believe it was 80. And we had seen them do was run out of the straight I formation. They had really not done anything. They came into the game like 4-8 or 4-9 or something. This is Bill Walsh's first year, I believe, out there. And the crazy part about it, we lined up the first play of the game, and they came out in this spread look. Well, we had never seen it. I'd never seen it. And I am. I'm safety, and I'm responsible for getting guys lined up, the back four. Okay. And our linebacker, Steve Nelson, he's responsible for the front seven. I looked at Nelly, and he looked back at me, and he's like shrugging his head. I'm like, don't ask me. I got no clue what they're doing. They had Dwight Clark lined up, inside. They had, a tight end was flexed. They had it's Freddie Solomon to one side, wide receiver out on the other side. It was just crazy. And it really took us. This is the type of thing. The reason I tell this story, this is the type of thing South Carolina might need to do. Okay. This was the birth of the West Coast offense. It really was. That day was the first time they had ever run the West Coast offense against us. That was it. We had never seen it. It literally took us a half to figure it out, what they were doing, because we couldn't declare the strength of the formation, which way they were, where their strength was. They had Roger Craig in the backfield, but they had Charlie Young at one tight end. Then they had Russ Francis or they had another tight end over there. We couldn't decide when they had two wide receivers. Couldn't decide, okay, where are we going to call the strength of the formation? It looks like it's balanced, so finally, we just did after a half. I'll never forget old Rod Rust, our defensive coordinator. He finally looked at me. He says, "Oh hell, just declare it to the left." He said, "Don't worry about it unless it's, a true three, receiver to one side." The problem with it is they'd line up three receivers and then they'd run one of them across to make it a balanced formation again. So we never could figure it out, And literally, we played that game. We finally had to play the rest of the game in just a base front, because nobody knew how to defend it. We couldn't line up to defend it. So we said, okay, this is just jaw-to-jaw football now, fellas. You guys up front, line it up, because we can't figure it out. Nobody in the secondary could ever figure out what the heck they were doing. But he literally, and I talked to Joe after that game. I said, Joe, what in the God? I said, man, what was that? And he said, Rick, he said, we put that in this week. That's the first time we've put that in and ran it. And he said it was as much novice to us as it was to y'all. He said, because we had not practiced. This was our practice. It was like no training camp time of this. We've never seen it. And he came in on our off day and he says, we're going to go with something different next week, fellas. And literally, it was the most different thing I'd ever seen at the time. That's the type thing South Carolina might need to think about this week, just for confusion factor, just a confusion factor.
Oh, completely agree with the philosophy there. It's just the magnitude. It's crazy because you were there. You saw the birth of what became the trendy offense in an entire sport for 15 years?
Yeah.
I think is how the West Coast offense was. And
yeah, it really was. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, I'd never seen it. I was like, this is just bizarre. I mean, when they first, because I expected them to come out in a straight I formation, fullback, Roger Craig at tailback, and first down, boy, they lined up. We just kicked the football off to them. They lined up, and you got your two tight ends there, and you got your two wide receivers. You got your one back there, and literally, Roger Craig was such a great football player because not only was he a great runner. You go back and look at the passes that he caught. He catch 100 balls a year because the West Coast offense was really not that hard to figure out after you had seen it, okay? Because Joe Montana, it is a one look, it's a two look, and then it's a dump to Roger Craig. That's what it was. You have a curl, you'd have a post behind it, or you'd have a Dwight Clark just clearing out the middle, and then you'd have a drag, coming underneath it with Freddie Solomon. It really wasn't something that was, it was just novel. It was a novel thing that nobody had really seen. South Carolina needs to scheme up Georgia in some way like that. I would love to see them just do something different, put in confusion, put in, three receivers to the one side, and shift guys. Make them. All it is about is trying. The West Coast offense was nothing but confusion. That's all it was. It was to try to confuse a defense. Okay, and it really wasn't that confusing once you had seen it and prepared for it. but we had no preparation for it. That's the type thing you have to come up with. And I don't have all the answers, Tim, for South Carolina this week. I really don't have any answers other than I think you've got to control that clock and control that scoreboard.
So in that kind of a line of thinking, I mean, I'm just trying to think of any kind of possibility of some sort of new scheme to where you can have all of that, right? It seems like an awful lot to ask. First of all, against the number one team in the country, but then to come up with something new that will also give the Gamecocks what they need in this thing, which is not just scoring a bunch of points, but also controlling the football, man. We saw some like wishbone look against Georgia State, something odd like that. I mean, that's odd in 2022 for sure.
Well, what do you have to lose? I mean, you're a 24.5-point underdog here, okay? You're not going to beat this team head up, okay? You're not going to be able to line up on the football and just run the ball over this football team. It's not going to happen, okay? It's just not going to happen. So you've got to look for innovative ways, and that's where great coaching comes in, Tim. And you've got to look for innovative ways to hold on to the football when you are outmanned. Okay, and this team is outmanned. There's no doubt in my mind. Georgia has the best football players in the Southeastern Conference. That means they have the best football players in the country. Okay, so I don't see South Carolina, outmanning them. So then you got to do what? You got to out scheme them. Okay, so that is what I'm going to be interested to see. And if you can out scheme them enough to where you can keep that scoreboard, that clock running, and you got more points on the one side than they do, then you're doing something right. And I expect that the coaching staff this week, they realize this. I mean, and I think even some of the players realize that. Okay. Now that doesn't mean they're going to go out there and lay down and allow a 24.5-point victory over them. So, but I do think you have to give them opportunities to where you can make this thing more reasonable and try to keep this game close and get it into the fourth quarter.
Is there any trick to playing well early in a game? Because 21-3 last week did not look good. There have been some slow starts, and especially when you're taking on the number one team in the country, I'm thinking if you can start well, it will go a lot better, especially for a noon game at Williams-Brice.
Definitely, you've got to start well. I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, you cannot fall behind this football team. You've got to keep this thing at worst tied, okay, or within a score, okay? That, to me, that's how you can still predicate in doing the things that you want to do offensively to try to give your players, some sort of advantage. If you get behind a team, Tim, it takes away a lot of that because then you've got to start pressing. You got to start taking more chances. And what happens when you start taking more chances against a group that is superior to you, it allows them to put themselves in better position to make plays. Like, they can get the people on the field that they want to on certain downs and distances, okay? But I do think, to me, South Carolina, this is not a huddle up and let's just drive it forward against this group of guys. You better come up and you better scheme them because this is the only way that I see South Carolina be able to keep this game close.
Man, love hearing the insight. That story about the West Coast offense, absolutely fantastic, Rick.
I'll never forget it.
Well, I don't think a lot of people in football ever forget that. That was good stuff. And seeing it, I can't imagine seeing it unfold right before your eyes like you did.
Yeah.
Before we let you go, anything that stood out to you from an SEC perspective? I mean, we were talking earlier, 24.5 points. That's what a lot of those Sun Belt teams last week were those kind of underdogs on the road, Texas A&M and Nebraska and Notre Dame. You didn't see that one coming. It's what college football is. That's what stood out to me so far this season.
Well, what stood out to me is that those teams have got some pretty darn good players. I mean, you look at Appalachian can play with a lot of, Division I schools. I mean, that's a good football team over there. They really should have beat North Carolina the first week. That was kind of a giveaway what they did in Boone that day. I think Appalachian is as good as a lot of, frontline schools. I can say this. I'm glad South Carolina doesn't play them this year because I'm not sure South Carolina could beat them. right now. I'm really not. I mean, if you take anything away from playing teams like Appalachian and Georgia State, is don't play them early. I mean, it's not a good idea to play these teams early because they're all healthy. I mean, they haven't had a chance for injuries and things like that. I thought Chase Bryce did a great job, of controlling that game. They are going to, when you look at some of these smaller schools, it just goes to show you that they're getting some players. I mean, they are really getting some really good football players. And that for whatever reason aren't being looked at bigger schools or they're just ending up going there. So I was very impressed. I don't expect, look, this is not going to be, this is Georgia. This isn't Texas A&M. This isn't Notre Dame. Okay, Notre Dame has been a big disappointment. This isn't any of those. Georgia is the best football team in the country right now. So you better out-scheme them. You better figure out a way to try to keep this game and give your players advantages in certain situations. And don't forget, Tim, do not snap the ball until you've used the clock. Okay, I can tell. Do not snap the ball. I understand doing it, just to keep them honest occasionally. Okay, but overall, just line up on the football. Don't snap the ball until you have to snap it because you're using clock. But you got to maintain getting first downs while you're doing that.
Good stuff. Rick Sanford, man. Looking forward to recapping this Georgia game with you. It will be a different type of conversation, certainly the next couple of weeks around Gamecock football, and then it really gets into the meat of 6 straight games in the SEC. But looking forward to the number 1 matchup at Williams-Brice. Appreciate all the insight today, and thanks for the time, man.
Absolutely, Tim. Great stuff, man. I'll see you next week.
Sounds good. Rick Sanford, ladies and gentlemen. A guy who saw the birth of the West Coast offense on the field against him. To hear that personal first-person recount of that, it's just that, like, you're looking around like, what's going on? Being mystified by that. I'd say the odds of South Carolina pulling up something like that, not too good. But you can do it, I think, in really small, in a scaled-down version is a possibility, right? Because Georgia State, I don't think, was prepared for like the T formation, the wishbone, whatever you want to call it, in game number 1. Clearly, Marcus Satterfield has the aptitude and the creative license. Shane Beamer thinks that way. He knows they got to do something outside the box. They feel like the program is kind of outside the box thinkers. You can't base your SEC college football program on love without being a bit of an outside the box thinker. So the possibility is there. The likelihood, I think, from a realistic standpoint, is it's not great. Ryan says, I'm going to have to watch that Oregon game. I'm just not ready to anoint Georgia champions after 2 games. 49-3, Ryan. What do you got to watch, man? It's complete domination. Georgia's been the best team in college football this year, especially after watching Alabama and Texas. That struggle. That doesn't mean they're going to necessarily win it back-to-back. But it does mean you got to give them credit for filling the holes of all the guys that left. I talked about it before the season start. We saw this with Clemson several years ago. It's easy to talk about, oh, look at all these guys going to the NFL. It's going to be very difficult. But when you had Brent Venables running that defense, he was just like, come on, let's do it. The next guy's up. You're in. And they were just as good, if not better. And that's seemingly where Georgia is. Seemingly, there's no way that Will Muschamp and company should have gone to Athens a couple of years ago and pulled off a win. Now, if you want to be a Polly or a Nancy negative instead of the Polly positive there and say, well, if that happened just a few years ago and Kirby Smart was the coach, he's going to make dang sure that's not going to happen again. Well, this time you do have the home field advantage on your side at least. It's a little bit different. You do have Spencer Rattler as your quarterback. I think that gives you a better chance. But we'll see. Before we get out of here today, I wanted to make sure that I tell you about a sponsor of the program, Freedom Primary Care, who I trust my family to take care of, or to take care of my family. And the freedom part of Freedom Primary Care, one of the main reasons why. They value your freedom. They will not pressure you into any specific decisions. They know that they are responsible to you, not responsible for you. And that is a huge distinction in 2022. 803-627-2447 is the number for Freedom Primary Care. They're located up in Fort Mill, right near where I am. If you are not close to that area, you can still check out Freedom Primary Care. They have telemedicine options, so you can meet virtually, and they can give you the care, the advice. They can set you on the path of care that you need. For instance, if you're more naturally minded, they'll set you down the path to care that way. Or if you're more conservative or traditional minded, they can give you that path of care as well. Freedom Primary Care, naturally minded primary care that puts you in charge of your health. Freedom and medical decisions. Again, never thought I would be talking about that, but that's where we are. Check out Freedom Primary Care supporting this show. If you can support them, that is always a great scenario here on the show. I appreciate you guys supporting this show today. DC, not necessarily is definitely not poly positive here. I have absolutely no confidence in Marcus Satterfield coming up with a unique game plan for Georgia. I understand. DC, I'm guessing you had about that same confidence level going into the bowl game last year. I think I did. I think most realistic Gamecock fans did. Now, Georgia and North Carolina, apples and oranges defensively. No doubt about it. But I don't think you can win a game like you won it against North Carolina. You can win a game like you won it against Georgia a few years ago in Athens. That you don't have to score if you get a good defensive performance. You get some turnovers. You get some key plays. I think you can win a game with a similar type score that we saw a few years ago, but it would take a massive effort for sure. I don't know if we put in a massive effort today, but I did enjoy the show immensely, especially with Rick Sanford joining us. Appreciate the insight from the first round draft pick from the University of South Carolina, and especially, again, the birth of that West Coast offense. I'll definitely cut that out of this show. It'll be on the show segment page in case you came to our show today a little bit late, or you just want to go back and listen or watch that again. That will be available on the YouTube page. If you haven't, go subscribe, please. If you have anybody else interested in Gamecock football, please recommend that. And let's grow this thing as much as we can. Again, appreciate all you guys and all your contributions today. Chris, let's just score on them. I know that's a moral victory, but I think that'll give us a little bit more respect. I think you're going to get that, Chris. Like I mentioned before, Carolina always seems to play up to Georgia. They scored some points last year. I think they'll score some points this year, but we'll see. We got a peace out from DC, a good one today from Chris. Love the stories from these old guys, in quotes, Gamecocks. Love doing this with you each and every day, especially now that football season is here. We'll do it again tomorrow. That'll do it for today's September 13th edition of Tim Hill, Unrestricted Free Agent.